Hello everyone. So for this video, I actually want to do something a little bit different. For this entire series, we've been using Express to serve our endpoints. When a developer gets locked into a single tool for a long time like this, sometimes they worry about how the world works outside their chosen technology. So in this video, we're going to explore another web API framework in a language that's about as different from JavaScript as we can get. We're going to look at the SpringBoot web API framework written for Java and explore some of the similarities and differences to Express. We'll see how our knowledge of endpoints transfers to this new domain and draw some conclusions about programming in unfamiliar stacks. So as a disclaimer, the purpose of this video is not to make you a master of Spring Boot. I'm not expecting you to come away being able to write massive web applications using everything we've learned immediately. What I want you to do is just look for some common patterns and see how there are things that transfer. Even if you couldn't write this code, hopefully you'll still be able to read the app that we're creating and understand how each part is associated with something you know how to do in Express. So with those objectives stated, let us begin. So for our application, I'm actually first going to show you an application written in Express. So for my Express app here, I've got all of my code inside this source folder. As far as model classes, I've got this really simple room object. It's got a constructor. You give it some parameters. It saves them on itself. It's got a nice little get area function. We use this in a room router. So this room router has some data set, creates a bunch of these objects with different values. And then we've got a couple endpoints. If you just get on this router directly, I'll give you all of the rooms. If you get from this router looking for a specific named room, then we pull out that URL template parameter, try to find a matching room, comparing each one. If we find one, we return that. If not, we return a 404 with a helpful error message. And then our main app class does exactly what all of our main app classes always do. Creates the Express app, attaches this router for room, and then listens on port 9999. There's nothing too fancy here, nothing too complicated. It's definitely simpler than the last few apps we've made using SQLize and databases, but it conveys most of the basic principles of RESTful API design. If I were going to run this, I could run app.js and then pop on over to rested. And in rested, I would be able to visit localhost 9999/room. And when I send that request, I get back all of the rooms here. If I did /room/bedroom, then I get back the information just about the bedroom. The app works about like we'd expect. So now, let's imagine what it would look like if for this entire series, we had instead been focusing on Java. So Java is a very different language in the sense that it is a strongly object-oriented language. Every single line of code has to be part of a class. So a lot of things like our startup code would need to look a little bit different. And our routers would need to look a little bit different because all of the endpoints we make would have to be methods of a class. All of the different setup things would be done with all different objects. But turns out it's not as different as you might think. So if I were to code that same app, it might look something like this. So I've got same exact folder structure that we had last time. We've got some models a room object, which is just a class, declares its attributes, sets them in a constructor. It's got some getters to access the things that we want to make available. And then once we have that object, I can make a router class, which Spring Boot calls a controller. That class needs to be defined in its own file. And maybe I've got my same data set that we had before. And then inside that class, where I say, okay, this is the /room controller. When you visit /room, this is what I'm talking about. I can make methods, and each method describes one of the endpoints that I want to be accessible. Here, for my getRooms, previously this was router.get, and then the first parameter was a /, the second parameter was a function. Here, I just write a function, getRooms, that returns all of my rooms. And then above, I provide this annotation @getMapping. So we can see this is communicating a lot of that same information. The type of request I'm doing is a get. The URL parameter, the URL template string, is right on the controller. The function returns some type of data. All of that same information is there. It's just been shuffled around and represented in a different way. Similarly, if I wanted to write a endpoint that allowed me to use a URL template, I can do that. In Express, this was our router.get, and then the first argument was :name. Now it's curly braces name. Changes ever so slightly. It's again attached to a method. And then in Java, because it is strongly typed and everything can be resolved as long as we give it the right typing information, we actually say, hey, rather than having this amorphous request object that I can pull params out of, these are just parameters to my function. That URL template name is just a string name that you give me in this function, and I'm going to annotate it, say this is a path variable. That's where you populate it from. We can do all of that same logic that we did, take our rooms, filter on a room with the same name, find the first match. If there is a match, return it. Otherwise, send the status code not found with that same error message. Spring Boot handles status codes slightly differently in the sense that there are a couple different ways to do it. You can either throw an exception and say, okay, I am aborting, I cannot continue, or you can create a whole fancy object to represent the full request. If it extends the correct thing, you can drop a status code in there. But we can see all of these same elements that we saw in our Express router. We've got endpoint methods that have URL templates and HTTP verbs. This pattern continues. To actually bundle this all together, we also need an application class. So this was like our app.js in Express. Here in Spring Boot, you actually create a class and a main method, because the main method is always the function that's going to run right when your program starts. And then in here, we create an application object. It's not an Express object because we're not in Express. Because we're in Spring, it's a Spring application object. But once we get this app, we can set some things on it, like the port number. I'm going to set it to 8888 so it doesn't conflict with the currently running 9999. But then I can app.run this thing. Another neat thing about Spring Boot and some of these other frameworks that exist in strongly object-oriented languages, by annotating this with @SpringBoot Application, it's actually going to go and scan everything in this app folder and all of the subfolders to look for things that are controllers. So remember, we had this room controller. Unlike Express, I don't need to manually attach it. I don't need to say app.use and then provide it this thing. As long as this @REST controller is here, it's going to include it. And this @request mapping will actually be how it decides the first part of that URL stem. Otherwise, this looks fairly similar to what we did in Express. We're creating an app object, setting its properties, and then telling it to go and run. The last piece that is different with Spring Boot is we can't bun install Express. In Java, we tend to use a build tool like Gradle or Maven or Ant. So instead of installing Express, we go out, tell it, look on Maven Central for Spring Boot. My source code lives here. My main class is here. And if I do all of that setup, I'm using Gradle in this that way. If I tell it to Gradle run, it's going to go and print out a ton of stuff saying, hey, Spring Boot is initialized. It's starting up, initialized on port 8888, even gives us fairly similar messages to what we got with Express. And then if I pop on over back to rested, we can see if I go to localhost 8888/room, that should go to that default method on our controller, and we get a response that looks so similar to what we got from JavaScript. Each one of those room objects gets mapped into JSON, and we see the name property with a name, the width with a width. If I go and visit a specific one of these, like say I want the bedroom, it goes and it grabs me just the information of that bedroom. And because Java is a little bit more strict with visibility of attributes, it even nicely goes and creates attributes for each public getter function that we make. If you made a function on room, that is get area, it even just gives us back that area directly right here. So we can see there are differences. Things don't work exactly the same, but a lot of that knowledge is going to transfer. Endpoints are not something that is unique to Express. These concepts come up again and again in every single web API framework you'll ever use. Some of them have extra bells and whistles, like HTML templating. Some, like PHP, have you write your code directly inside your HTML files, kind of break down the barrier between client and server. But ultimately, all of the things that you've learned in this web development series applies no matter what language you're working with. Like I said, the goal of this video was not to make you a master of Express, or a master of Spring Boot rather, in order to go out and write every single one of these frameworks at once, but hopefully this has given you a little bit more confidence that the knowledge that you've learned through this course is much more generally applicable, even if the job that you're applying to is in C# or Java or any other popular language for server-side programming. So in our next video, we're going to be looking at some more fun APIs that are available on the client, how we can integrate them into the server. We'll be back in Express for that, but hopefully this detour was fun for you. Definitely is for me, but I will catch you all in the next one.